the fog-drenched streets of 1920s London, a genius violinist lies dead in his locked studio, poisoned by cyanide. His masterpiece, the Symphonie Fantôme, stolen. Hercule Poirot, with his razor-sharp mind, unravels a web of envy, ambition, and obsession. A jealous rival, a steely conductor, a devoted fan. Each hides a secret, but only one orchestrated murder. A smudged letter, a scratched window, a deadly glass. Who stole the music that's worth killing for? The truth sings in the shadows, and Poirot will find it. Chapter 1. The Locked Studio. A sharp November wind sliced through the narrow streets of Bloomsbury, carrying with it the distant clatter of horse-drawn cabs and the murmur of London's evening pulse. Hercule Poirot, his immaculate black coat buttoned tightly against the chill, walked with a measured step, his ebony cane tapping rhythmically on the cobblestones. Beside him, Captain Arthur Hastings, ever the faithful shadow, pulled his scarf tighter, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold. The pair had been summoned with urgency to a modest yet elegant building on a quiet lane, home to the studio of Maurice Duval, a violinist whose compositions had set the city's musical salons ablaze with admiration. The call had come from Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard, his voice clipped and tinged with unease over the crackling telephone line at Poirot's flat. "It's murder, Poirot," he had said, with none of his usual bluff cheer. "Duval's dead, found in his locked studio, and there's a piece of music missing, his latest work, they say, a proper mystery for you." They reached the building, a three-story affair with a bookshop on the ground floor, its windows glowing warmly in the dusk. A narrow staircase, tucked beside shelves of leather-bound volumes, led to the studio above. At the top, a heavy oak door stood resolute, its brass lock gleaming under the gaslight. A constable guarded it, his face pale as he nodded to Japp, who waited inside the cramped landing. "Locked from the inside," Japp said, gesturing to the door as Poirot and Hastings entered. Key was in Duval's pocket, no sign of forced entry, and the windows barred tighter than a bank vault, 3 stories up, to boot. The studio itself was a sanctuary of art and solitude. A grand piano dominated one corner, its polished surface reflecting the flickering light of a single chandelier. Shelves lined with sheet music, meticulously organized, stretched along the walls, and a violin rested in an open, velvet-lined case, its strings catching the light like delicate threads of silver. At the center of the room, a mahogany desk bore the weight of tragedy. Maurice Duval, a man of perhaps 40, lay slumped across it, his dark hair disheveled, his once vibrant eyes staring blankly into eternity. A glass of brandy, half empty, stood beside him, and a faint, acrid scent, bitter almonds, hung in the air. Poirot's mustache twitched as he leaned closer, his gloved hands hovering over the scene without touching. "Cyanide, perhaps," he murmured, his voice soft but precise. "A swift and silent killer. But how was it administered, and by whom, in a room so securely sealed?" Japp scratched his chin, his brow furrowed. "That's not all, Poirot. The music, his Symphonie Fantôme, he called it, supposed to be his greatest work yet. The folder's there, empty as a pauper's pocket." He pointed to a leather folder on the desk, its label in Duval's elegant script. "Word is, it was worth a fortune to the right buyer. Now it's vanished." Poirot's eyes, sharp and green as a cat's, swept the room. The desk was orderly, save for a single sheet of paper, unrelated to the missing score, bearing a faint smudge of ink along its edge. He bent closer, noting the precision of Duval's workspace, pens aligned, manuscripts stacked with care. The smudge was an anomaly, a whisper of carelessness in a world of meticulous order. "This," Poirot said, pointing without touching, "is not the work of Monsieur Duval. He was a man of method. Someone else has been here." Hastings, peering over Poirot's shoulder, frowned. "But how, Poirot? The door was locked, the key in his pocket, the windows barred. No one could climb in or out without wings." Poirot crossed to the window, a tall, narrow pane set high in the wall, its iron bars spaced tightly. He requested a stool from the constable and climbed it with surprising agility for a man of his fastidious demeanor. His fingers traced the inner sill, pausing at a faint scratch, barely visible in the dim light. "Curieux," he murmured. "A mark, Hastings, not deep, but deliberate. Perhaps not to admit a person, but something smaller. A paper, perhaps?" Jap, pacing near the body, snorted. "A paper through a window? You're reaching, Poirot. And the poison? No one's pouring cyanide through a barred window 3 stories up." Poirot descended, his expression serene, but his mind ablaze. "Patience, mon ami. The how is but one thread. The why, this missing symphony fantôme, this music worth killing for, that is the heart of our mystery. We must learn who stood to gain from Duval's death and the theft of his masterpiece." He turned to the violin case, lifting the instrument gently, as if it might whisper its master's secrets. Monsieur Duval was a genius, but genius breeds envy, obsession, perhaps betrayal. We shall find the one who could not resist the lure of the phantom note. As the constable draped a sheet over Duval's body, Poirot's gaze lingered on the empty folder, its label a silent accusation. The locked studio held its secrets tightly, but Hercule Poirot, with his little gray cells, was determined to unravel them. Chapter 2. The 3 Suspects. The anteroom of Maurice Duval's studio, a cramped space barely large enough for a velvet-upholstered settee and a small table, was heavy with the scent of old books drifting up from the shop below. The gaslight flickered, casting long shadows on the paneled walls as Hercule Poirot settled onto the settee, his posture immaculate despite the late hour. Captain Arthur Hastings stood near the door, his hands clasped behind his back, his honest face creased with curiosity and unease. Inspector Jap, ever the man of action, paced the narrow floor, his boots creaking with each step. The tragedy of Duval's death hung over them, a dark melody unresolved, and the missing symphony fantôme was the silent note at its heart. Poirot's eyes, sharp and unyielding, surveyed the room as Jap outlined the task ahead. "We've got 3 people who were close to Duval," Jap said, flipping open his notebook with a practiced snap. "All of them were in the building last night for a recital in the bookshop downstairs. All claim to have left before midnight, when Duval was last seen locking himself in to work. But one of them, Poirot, knows more than they're letting on." Poirot inclined his head, his mustache twitching slightly. "Bon, let us meet these 3, Inspector, and observe the music of their souls. For it is in their words, their gestures, that the truth will play its first notes." Jap nodded and called for the first suspect to be brought in. The door opened, and Victor Langston entered, a man of perhaps 35, with angular features and dark eyes that darted restlessly. His coat was well tailored but slightly rumpled, as if he cared more for appearance than upkeep. His hands, long and sinewy, fidgeted at his sides, betraying a nervous energy that Poirot noted at once. Langston was a composer, Jap explained, once hailed as a prodigy but lately overshadowed by Duval's meteoric rise. The two had been friends in their youth, but rivalry had soured their bond. "Monsieur Langston," Poirot began, his voice smooth as velvet. "You were at the recital last night, oui? Tell me, what was your purpose in attending?" Langston's lips tightened, and he sat stiffly on the chair Japp offered. "I went to hear Duval play," he said, his tone clipped. "Everyone did. He was the talk of London, wasn't he? I wanted to see what all the fuss was about." A faint sneer curled his mouth, quickly suppressed. "After the recital, I went to the Black Swan Tavern. Dozens of people saw me there." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Dozens, you say? And yet, monsieur, the tavern is but a short walk from here. Time enough, perhaps, to return after the recital, non?" He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You envied Monsieur Duval, did you not? His success, his genius, it cast a shadow over your own." Langston's face flushed, and his fingers drummed on the arm of the chair. "Envy? Of course I envied him. Who wouldn't? The man had a gift, a cursed gift that made the rest of us look like amateurs. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're driving at." His voice rose, then faltered as he met Poirot's steady stare. "I stayed at the tavern until well past midnight. Ask anyone." Poirot made a small, dismissive gesture with his hand. "We shall verify, monsieur. But tell me, this Symphonie Fantôme, you knew of it?" Langston hesitated, his eyes flickering to the side. "Everyone did. Duval wouldn't shut up about it, said it was his masterpiece, the kind of work that comes once in a lifetime. I never saw the score, if that's what you mean." Poirot smiled faintly, a smile that promised no comfort. "Merci, Monsieur Langston. You may go. For now." As Langston left, his shoulders rigid with suppressed agitation, Hastings leaned toward Poirot. "He's a prickly sort, isn't he? That envy, it's practically written on his face." Poirot nodded. "Oui, Hastings, but envy alone does not a murderer make. We must look for the spark that turned envy to action. Let us see the next." Eleanor Voss entered next, a woman whose presence commanded the room like a conductor before an orchestra. Tall and imposing, with silver-streaked hair swept into an elegant chignon, she carried herself with the authority of one. Accustomed to being obeyed, her dark eyes, framed by sharp cheekbones, met Poirot's with a mixture of curiosity and defiance. As conductor of the London Philharmonic, she had worked closely with Duval, orchestrating his compositions to critical acclaim. Yet Japp hinted at a recent rift, a disagreement over the elusive Symphonie Fantôme. "Madame Voss," Poirot said, rising briefly in a gesture of courtesy. "You are a woman of great talent, non? To conduct the works of Maurice Duval must have been a privilege, and yet I hear there was discord between you." Voss's lips pressed into a thin line, but her voice remained steady. "Maurice was a genius, Monsieur Poirot, but a difficult one. He was secretive, obsessive. This Symphonie Fantôme, he promised it to me for the Philharmonic's spring season. It would have been a triumph, a defining moment for us both. But he changed his mind, said it wasn't ready. We argued, yes, but that's no crime." Poirot tilted his head, studying her as if she were a score to be deciphered. "And this argument, it took place when?" 2 days ago, Voss admitted. "Here, in his studio. He was stubborn, insisted on perfecting every note before anyone could see it. I told him he was squandering an opportunity, but he wouldn't listen." "And last night, after the recital?" Poirot's tone was mild, but his eyes missed nothing. "You were seen near the stairwell to this studio, madame, long after the others had left." Voss's composure flickered, a brief tightening of her jaw. I lingered to speak with the bookshop owner about a future event. Nothing more. I was home by 11, alone. She paused, then added sharply, "If you're suggesting I had anything to do with Maurice's death, you're mistaken. I needed him alive. His music was my legacy, too." Poirot's fingers steepled before him. "A legacy, oui, but one that depends on the score, does it not? A score now missing. Tell me, madame, did you ever see this Symphonie Fantôme?" Her eyes narrowed. Number Maurice guarded it like a jealous lover. I only heard him speak of it, its beauty, its power. He said it would redefine music itself. Poirot nodded, dismissing her with a polite gesture. As she swept out, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor, Hastings whispered, "She's hiding something, Poirot. That story about the bookshop owner, it's too neat." "Perhaps, mon ami," Poirot replied, his voice low. "But Madame Voss is a woman of control. If she lies, it is with purpose. Let us meet our final player in this symphony." Clara Merton was the last to enter, a stark contrast to the commanding Voss. Young, perhaps 22, she had a delicate beauty, with wide hazel eyes and auburn hair pinned loosely at her nape. Her hands twisted a damp handkerchief, and her cheeks bore the tracks of recent tears. Clara was, Japp explained, a devoted follower of Duval's, attending every recital, collecting his programs, and even attempting to play his compositions on her own modest violin. Her adoration bordered on worship, and her grief now seemed to consume her. "Mademoiselle Merton," Poirot said gently, his tone softening as he gestured to the chair. "You loved Monsieur Duval's music, oui? It spoke to your heart." Clara nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was everything. His music. It was like hearing the soul of the world. I went to every performance, just to be near it. Last night I was at the recital. I stayed late, hoping to speak with him, to tell him how much his work meant to me." "And did you speak with him?" Poirot's question was soft, but his gaze was unrelenting. She shook her head, tears spilling anew. Number I went to his studio door after the recital, about 11:30. I knocked, but it was locked. I heard him playing inside, a melody so beautiful it made my heart ache. I waited, but he didn't answer. Then there was silence. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her handkerchief. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "This melody, mademoiselle, describe it to me." Clara hesitated, then spoke haltingly. It was haunting, like a lament. A single violin, rising and falling, unresolved. It felt unfinished, but perfect in its longing. Poirot's fingers tapped lightly on the arm of the settee. "And after this silence, you left?" "Yes," she said quickly. "I went home. I thought he was just working, as he always did. I never imagined." Her voice trailed off, and she looked away, her hands trembling. Poirot observed her closely, noting a faint smudge of ink on the cuff of her sleeve, barely visible in the dim light. It was the same shade as the smudge on the paper in Duval's studio, a detail that sent a spark through his mind. "Merci, mademoiselle," he said, his tone kind but firm. "You have been most helpful." As Clara left, her steps faltering, Hastings turned to Poirot, his brow furrowed. "She's heartbroken, Poirot, but there's something off about her. That story about the melody. It's almost too poetic, don't you think?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet intensity. "Oui, Hastings, it is poetic, and it is precise. Too precise, perhaps, for one who merely stood at a door. Mademoiselle Merton knows more than she reveals, but whether it is love or guilt that drives her, We shall see. Japp, who had been silent during the interviews, now spoke up, his voice gruff. So, Poirot, what's your take? Langston's got the motive. Jealousy's written all over him. Voss had a row with Duval, and she's cagey about her movements. And the girl, well, she's a bit too devoted, if you ask me. But none of them could have got into that locked room, not without a key or a miracle. Poirot rose, adjusting his coat with a precise tug. Miracles, Inspector, are not required when the human heart is involved. Each of these three has a reason to desire the symphony fantôme, Langston for ambition, Voss for glory, Clara for devotion. But the method, the poison, the locked door, these are the notes we must harmonize. Let us return to the studio, for it is there that the truth will sing. They descended the staircase to the bookshop, where the recital had taken place the previous night. The room was still arranged with rows of chairs, a small stage at one end where Duval had played. Poirot paused, his eyes scanning the space, lingering on the staircase leading to the studio. The recital, he murmured. All were here, yet one found a way to Duval's side. We must learn more of their movements, their opportunities. He turned to Japp. The witnesses from the tavern, the bookshop owner, the stagehands, question them closely. And the studio, let us examine it again. The smudge, the scratch, the brandy glass, they hold secrets we have yet to uncover. As they stepped back into the cold night, Poirot's mind was already at work, weaving the threads of envy, ambition, and obsession into a pattern only he could see. The symphonie fantôme was gone, but its echo lingered, and Hercule Poirot would follow that echo to the truth. Chapter 3. The Scent of Cyanide. The morning after the interviews, a gray mist clung to the streets of Bloomsbury, muffling the clatter of early carts and the cries of newsboys. Hercule Poirot, impeccably dressed in a charcoal overcoat and Homburg hat, stood outside Maurice Duval's studio, his gloved hands clasped over the silver head of his cane. Captain Arthur Hastings, ever at his side, stifled a yawn, the late night's interrogations weighing on his soldierly frame. Inspector Japp had sent word to meet them at the studio, where the coroner's report had arrived, shedding light on the grim mechanics of Duval's death. Inside, the studio remained as they had left it, a silent monument to the violinist's genius. The air still carried the faint, bitter tang of almonds, though the body of Maurice Duval had been removed to the morgue. The grand piano gleamed dully under the morning light filtering through the barred window, and the empty folder labeled Symphony Fantôme lay accusingly on the desk. Japp, his face drawn from a sleepless night, greeted them with a nod, holding a thin sheaf of papers. Cyanide, as you suspected, Poirot, Japp said, tapping the coroner's report. In the brandy glass, not the bottle. Quick-acting, deadly in minutes. Duval drank it sometime between midnight and 1, based on the state of the body. No signs of a struggle. Just sat down at his desk and died. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he approached the desk, his gaze settling on the glass, its amber contents now clouded with residue. The glass, Inspector. It bears only Monsieur Duval's fingerprints, oui? Japp nodded. Just his. The bottle's clean, too. No trace of poison. Whoever did this knew Duval's habits, knew he'd pour himself a nightcap after the recital. Poirot bent closer, his nose twitching slightly as he inhaled the lingering scent. Cyanide is not subtle, yet it is precise. To place it in the glass alone, the murderer required access to this room before Duval locked himself in. Tell me, Inspector, What else do we know of the studio's contents? Japp gestured to the desk, where a single sheet of paper, unrelated to the missing score, caught Poirot's eye. It was a draft of a letter, unfinished, addressed to a music publisher, discussing terms for a future performance. A faint smudge of ink marred its edge, dark and irregular, as if made by a hurried hand. Poirot's fingers hovered over it, not touching, his mind cataloguing the anomaly. "This smudge," he said softly, "it is not the work of a man like Duval. His manuscripts, his notes, all are orderly, precise. This is the mark of another, someone less careful." Hastings, peering over Poirot's shoulder, frowned. "But who, Poirot? The door was locked, the key in Duval's pocket, and that window." He glanced at the high, barred pane, its iron lattice unyielding. "No one's climbing through that." Poirot crossed to the window, his steps deliberate. He requested a chair from the constable stationed outside and climbed it with surprising agility, his small frame balanced perfectly. His gloved fingers traced the inner sill, pausing at the faint scratch he had noted the previous day. It was shallow, barely a nick, but it ran parallel to the bars, suggesting something had been drawn across it with force. "Regardez, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice low with excitement. "This scratch, it is not natural wear. It speaks of intent, of something passed through the bars. Not a person, none, but perhaps a tool, a device." Japp, arms crossed, raised a skeptical brow. "A device? What, like a fishing line to snatch a paper? You're spinning fairy tales, Poirot. And the poison? You can't pour cyanide through a window 3 stories up." Poirot descended, his expression serene, but his eyes alight. "Not poured, Inspector, but delivered. The poison was placed in the glass earlier by one who knew Duval would drink alone. The music, however, was taken after his death. A separate act, perhaps, but part of the same symphony." He turned to the violin case, its instrument untouched since their last visit. Lifting the violin gently, he examined its strings, noting a faint residue of rosin, as if played recently. Duval was working, playing, before he died. Mademoiselle Merton spoke of a melody she heard through the door, a haunting lament. We must consider what this tells us. Hastings rubbed his chin. "Clara Merton, you mean? She said she heard him playing around 11:30. Could she have been involved?" Poirot's mustache twitched. "Possibly, mon ami, but we must not rush to judgment. The melody she described, it is a clue, but to what? Was it truly Symphonie Fantôme, or something else? And this smudge?" He gestured to the letter on the desk. "It matches the ink on Mademoiselle Merton's sleeve, yet it could also belong to another. We must investigate further." Japp, growing impatient, tapped his foot. "Investigate what, Poirot? We've got a locked room, a poisoned glass, and a missing score. Langston's got motive, jealousy's plain as day. Voss was cross with Duval over the score, and the Merton girls obsessed. But how did any of them get in here?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "The how, Inspector, will reveal itself when we understand the why. The Symphonie Fantôme, it is the key. Why steal it? To sell it? To claim it? To destroy it? Each suspect had reason to desire it, but only one had the opportunity to act." He paced the room, his cane tapping softly on the floorboards. "Let us consider the timeline. The recital ended at 10. Duval was seen ascending to his studio at 11, locking the door. Mademoiselle Merton claims she heard him playing at 11:30. By 1, he was dead, the score gone. We must verify the alibis of our suspects during this window." Jap nodded, jotting in his notebook. I've got men checking Langston's story at the Black Swan. Voss says she was home alone, but we're asking the bookshop owner about her lingering near the stairwell. As for the girl, her landlady might confirm when she got home. Bon, Poirot said, and we must examine this room further. The desk, the glass, the window, they hold secrets yet to be uncovered. Hastings, observe the shelves. He gestured to the rows of sheet music, neatly arranged but slightly askew in one section. Is there not a gap, a space where something was removed? Hastings stepped forward, squinting at the shelves. You're right, Poirot. There's a spot here, just wide enough for a folder like the one on the desk. Could it be where the Symphony Fantôme was kept? Poirot nodded. Possibly, but if it was taken from the desk, why the gap on the shelf? Perhaps the score was moved before the theft, or another document was taken to confuse us. He turned to Jap. Have your men search for any trace of the score, paper, ink, even a fragment, and the brandy glass. Send it for further analysis. There may be residue beyond cyanide. Jap sighed but nodded. You're thorough, I'll give you that. Anything else, Poirot? Oui, Poirot said, his voice firm. The bookshop below. The recital was held there, and all our suspects were present. We must speak with the owner, the staff, anyone who saw them after 10. The smallest detail, a glance, a movement, may be the note that breaks the silence. They descended to the bookshop, a cozy space lined with oak shelves and lit by soft gas lamps. The owner, a wiry man named Mr. Pennington, greeted them with a nervous smile. He confirmed the recital had been a success, with Duval playing to a packed room. He was brilliant, Pennington said, his eyes distant. That violin, it was like he spoke to the heavens. After, he went upstairs, said he had work to do. I saw him lock the door myself. And the others? Poirot asked. Monsieur Langston, Madame Voss, Mademoiselle Merton. What did they do? Pennington rubbed his hands together. Langston left right after, said he was off to the tavern. Voss stayed a bit, chatting with me about a future concert, but she was gone by 11, I'd say. The girl, Clara, she was the last to leave, hovering by the stairs like she didn't want to go. Kept looking up toward the studio. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Merci, Monsieur Pennington. You have been most helpful. As they stepped back into the mist, Hastings turned to Poirot. Clara again, Poirot. She's always at the edges of this, isn't she? That business about the melody, and now lingering by the stairs. Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. She is a puzzle, Hastings. Her devotion is genuine, but devotion can mask darker motives. Yet we must not forget Langston's ambition or Voss's pride. The truth lies in the interplay of their desires. He paused, gazing at the studio's barred window high above. The scent of cyanide, the scratch on the sill, the smudge of ink. These are the chords of our mystery. We shall play them until the melody is clear. With that, Poirot turned toward the street, his mind already orchestrating the next steps in their pursuit of the phantom note. Chapter 4. The Rival's Ambition. The late morning sun struggled through the heavy clouds over London, casting a pallid light on the narrow streets as Hercule Poirot and Captain Arthur Hastings made their way to Victor Langston's flat in Fitzrovia. The air was damp, carrying the faint tang of coal smoke, and Poirot's polished boots clicked sharply on the pavement, a counterpoint to Hastings' broader, soldierly stride. The investigation into Maurice Duval's murder had gained urgency, with the coroner's confirmation of cyanide and the tantalizing mystery of the missing symphony fantôme. Langston, the rival composer whose star had dimmed in Duval's shadow, was their first stop. His nervous demeanor and evasive answers from the previous night lingering in Poirot's mind like an unresolved chord. The flat was in a modest Georgian building, its facade weathered but respectable. A landlady, her apron dusted with flour, admitted them with a wary glance, directing them to a second-floor door where manuscripts spilled from every surface like leaves in an autumn storm. Victor Langston stood at a cluttered table, sorting papers with a distracted air, his angular face tightening as he saw his visitors. His shirt was wrinkled, his dark hair unkempt, and his eyes darted with the unease of a man who sensed the net closing. "Monsieur Langston," Poirot began, his voice smooth and deliberate as he removed his hat and placed it carefully on a chair. "We meet again. You will forgive the intrusion, but the matter of Monsieur Duval's death requires further illumination. May we sit?" Langston gestured grudgingly to a pair of mismatched chairs, his fingers twitching as he pushed aside a stack of scores. "I've told you everything," he said, his tone sharp. "I was at the Black Swan after the recital. I didn't see Duval, didn't touch his brandy, didn't steal his precious music." Poirot's mustache curved slightly, a smile that held no warmth. "And yet, monsieur, your words are like a melody played out of tune. You admit to envy, to resentment of Duval's success. A composer such as yourself, once celebrated, now overlooked. It must have been a bitter pill." Langston's jaw clenched and he leaned back, crossing his arms. "Bitter? Of course it was. Duval had the critics eating out of his hand, the audiences swooning. My work, solid, respectable, couldn't compete with his magic. But that's no crime. I didn't kill him." Poirot's eyes, green and piercing, fixed on Langston. "No, envy alone is not a crime. But let us speak of opportunity. The Black Swan is a mere 10 minutes' walk from the studio. You left the recital at 10, oui? Yet the tavern's patrons recall you arriving closer to 11. Where were you in that hour, monsieur?" Langston's fingers drummed on the table, a nervous rhythm. "I walked slowly, stopped to think. I was frustrated after the recital. Duval's performance was flawless, as always. I needed air." "Air," Poirot repeated softly, his gaze drifting to the cluttered table. Among the papers, he spotted a waste bin overflowing with crumpled sheets. With a delicate gesture, he retrieved a scrap, unfolding it to reveal musical notation, fragmented but hauntingly familiar, with a cadence that echoed Clara Merton's description of the melody she'd heard through Duval's door. "And this, monsieur? An exercise, perhaps." Langston's face paled, but he recovered quickly. "Just a sketch. I'm always working, trying new ideas. It's nothing to do with Duval." Poirot held the scrap up, his fingers careful not to smudge the ink. "Curieux, is it not, that this sketch bears such resemblance to the style of Monsieur Duval? The same unresolved lament, the same delicate phrasing. You knew of Symphony Fantôme, did you not? Perhaps you saw it, studied it?" Langston stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "That's absurd. I told you, I never saw his score. Everyone knew he was working on something grand, but he kept it locked away. If you're accusing me, where's your proof?" Poirot's smile was serene, but his eyes were unyielding. "Proof, monsieur, is like a symphony. It builds, note by note. This scrap, it is a note. The smudge of ink on Duval's desk, another. And your absence from the tavern, a third. We shall see how they harmonize." Hastings, who had been silent, leaned forward. "Look here, Langston, you're not helping yourself. If you've got nothing to hide, why so jumpy? That music in your bin, it's too close to Duval's style for coincidence." Langston's hands balled into fists, but he sank back into his chair. "I admired his work, all right. Sometimes I'd try to mimic his style, to understand it. That's all. I didn't kill him, and I didn't steal his score." Poirot folded the scrap carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "Merci, Monsieur Langston. We shall speak again. For now, I advise you to remain in London. The little grey cells, they are not yet satisfied." As they left the flat, Hastings glanced at Poirot, his brow furrowed. "That music, Poirot, it's got to be a clue. He's copying Duval, or worse, he's got his hands on the Symphonie Fantôme." Poirot nodded, his cane tapping rhythmically as they descended the stairs. "Possibly, mon ami, but we must be cautious. Langston is a man consumed by ambition, yet ambition can drive one to creation or destruction. This scrap, it is a shadow of Duval's genius. But is it theft or mere imitation? We must learn more of his movements that night." They stepped into the street, where a hansom cab waited to take them to their next destination. Poirot's mind was already turning, weaving the threads of Langston's agitation, the ink-smudged paper, and the missing score into a pattern. "Hastings," he said, his voice low, "we must verify Langston's alibi at the Black Swan. The tavern keeper, the patrons, they will tell us if his story holds. And we must return to the studio. There is something there, a detail we have overlooked, that will sing to us of the truth." The cab rattled through the streets, and Poirot gazed out at the passing city, his thoughts as intricate as the music he sought to recover. Langston's ambition was a motive, but the locked studio and the poisoned brandy demanded more. A method, a moment, a mistake. The Symphonie Fantôme was out there, hidden in the shadows, and Poirot would not rest until its phantom notes were brought to light. Chapter 5. The Conductor's Secret. The afternoon light filtered through the high windows of the London Philharmonic's rehearsal hall, casting long shadows across rows of empty chairs and music stands. The air hummed with the faint resonance of a tuning violin, abruptly silenced as Hercule Poirot and Captain Arthur Hastings entered. Eleanor Voss, the conductor whose steely presence had commanded their attention the previous night, stood at the podium, her baton poised over a score, as if ready to summon a storm of sound. Her silver-streaked hair gleamed under the gaslights, and her dark eyes, sharp as a hawk's, fixed on Poirot with a mixture of curiosity and guarded reserve. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," she greeted, her voice crisp yet tinged with impatience. "I trust this visit pertains to Maurice Duval's unfortunate demise and not some trifling matter of musical critique." She set the baton down, her movements precise, and descended from the podium to meet them. Poirot removed his hat, placing it carefully on a nearby stand, his mustache twitching with a faint smile. "Madame Voss, your reputation as a conductor is beyond critique, but it is indeed the tragedy of Monsieur Duval that brings us here. His death and the theft of his Symphonie Fantôme demand answers, and you, I believe, may hold a key to this mystery." Voss's lips pressed into a thin line, but she gestured to a cluster of chairs near the stage. "Very well. Ask your questions, but be quick. I have a rehearsal to prepare, and the Philharmonic does not pause for tragedy." They sat, Hastings shifting uncomfortably under Voss's imperious gaze, while Poirot remained serene, his hands folded neatly over his cane. "Madame," he began, "you spoke of an argument with Monsieur Duval 2 days before his death. A disagreement over the Symphonie Fantôme, oui? You wished to premiere it, yet he refused. Tell me, what was the nature of this dispute?" Voss's eyes flickered, a momentary crack in her composure. "Maurice was maddeningly secretive," she said, her tone clipped. "He promised the Philharmonic the premiere of his new work, a piece he claimed would redefine orchestral music. I spent months planning, securing patrons, arranging rehearsals. Then, 2 days ago, he came to me here, in this very hall, and said it wasn't ready. He wanted to delay, to tinker endlessly with his precious notes. I told him he was being selfish, that the world deserved to hear it." "And this made you angry," Poirot said, his voice soft but probing. "Angry enough, perhaps, to take matters into your own hands?" Voss's gaze hardened. "If you're implying I killed him, Monsieur Poirot, you're mistaken. I needed Maurice alive. His music was my triumph as much as his. Without him, the Symphonie Fantôme is lost to us all." Poirot tilted his head, his eyes never leaving hers. "Lost, perhaps, but not irretrievable. The score was stolen, Madame, from a locked studio. You were seen near the stairwell to that studio after the recital, long after you claimed to have left. Why linger, if not to seek out Monsieur Duval?" Voss's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair, but her voice remained steady. "I told you, I was speaking with Mr. Pennington about a future concert. The bookshop is a valuable venue for us. I was there no later than 11, then I went home. Alone, yes, but that's no crime." Hastings, unable to contain himself, leaned forward. "But Madame Voss, the stagehand saw you by the stairs, closer to midnight. That's not exactly chatting with the bookshop owner, is it?" Voss's eyes flashed, but she recovered quickly. "The stagehand is mistaken. I was in the bookshop, not loitering by the stairs like some thief. I had no reason to go to Maurice's studio. I knew he was working and wouldn't be disturbed." Poirot's fingers tapped lightly on his cane, a rhythm as deliberate as a metronome. "And yet, Madame, you desired the Symphonie Fantôme. A work of such brilliance, you said, would elevate the Philharmonic, cement your legacy. If Duval withheld it, might you not have sought to secure it by any means?" Voss stood abruptly, her posture rigid. "That's preposterous. I am a conductor, not a murderer. I revered Maurice's talent, even if his stubbornness infuriated me. If you have evidence, produce it. Otherwise, I have work to do." Poirot rose, his manner unruffled. "Evidence, Madame, is like a symphony. It builds to its crescendo. But let us consider one detail. The studio's desk bore a smudge of ink, a careless mark not in keeping with Duval's meticulous nature. And you, as one who handles scores daily, might have touched such a paper, non?" Voss's expression remained impassive, but a faint flush crept up her neck. "I handle countless papers, Monsieur Poirot. Ink is no stranger to me, but I was not in that studio after the recital, and I did not touch his score." Poirot nodded, as if satisfied, though his eyes gleamed with unspoken thoughts. "Merci, Madame Voss. We shall not detain you further, for now, but I advise you to remain available. The truth, it has a way of conducting itself to the surface." As Voss returned to her podium, her baton snapping up to resume rehearsal, Poirot and Hastings stepped out into the hall's foyer. The strains of a mournful adagio followed them, a fitting echo of the case's somber tone. Hastings turned to Poirot, his brow furrowed. "She's as cool as ice, Poirot, but that story about the bookshop doesn't hold water. The stagehand's no fool. He saw her by the stairs. Poirot's mustache twitched. Oui, Hastings. And her composure is a mask, but a well-crafted one. Madame Voss is a woman of ambition, of control, yet her anger at Duval's refusal betrays a passion that could turn dangerous. We must verify her movements with this stagehand and with Mr. Pennington. The smallest discrepancy may be the note that breaks her alibi. They hailed a cab to return to Bloomsbury, where Japp awaited with updates on the Black Swan's patrons and Clara Merton's landlady. As the cab rattled through the streets, Poirot gazed out at the passing city, his mind weaving the threads of Voss's defiance, Langston's nervous ambition, and Clara's tearful devotion. The Symphonie Fantôme remained a phantom indeed, its absence a silent accusation, but Poirot's little gray cells were tuning to the rhythm of the truth, ready to uncover the secret that lay hidden in the conductor's score. Chapter 6. The Fan's Devotion. The dusk settled over London like a velvet curtain, softening the edges of Bloomsbury's narrow streets as Hercule Poirot and Captain Arthur Hastings approached the modest lodgings of Clara Merton. The air carried a damp chill, and gaslights flickered to life, casting pools of yellow light on the cobblestones. Poirot, his overcoat buttoned tightly and his cane tapping a steady rhythm, seemed undeterred by the gathering gloom, his mind as sharp as the evening's bite. Hastings, ever loyal, walked beside him, his thoughts tangled with the threads of the case. Cyanide, a locked studio, and the elusive Symphonie Fantôme. Clara Merton's residence was a narrow, terraced house, its facade unassuming but tidy, with lace curtains framing the windows. A landlady, a stout woman with a suspicious squint, admitted them after a moment's scrutiny, leading them to a small parlor on the ground floor. The room was a shrine to Maurice Duval's genius. Posters of his concerts adorned the walls, a shelf held neatly arranged programs, and a worn violin rested on a side table, its bow lying beside it like a faithful companion. Clara sat on a faded sofa, her auburn hair loosely pinned, her hazel eyes red-rimmed from weeping. She clutched a handkerchief, its edges frayed from constant twisting, and rose unsteadily as Poirot and Hastings entered. "Mademoiselle Merton," Poirot began, his voice gentle yet precise as he placed his hat carefully on a nearby chair. "You have suffered a great loss, I see. The death of Monsieur Duval has wounded you deeply. Non?" Clara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "He was everything. His music. It spoke to me like nothing else. To think he's gone, and his masterpiece stolen." Her eyes filled, and she pressed the handkerchief to her lips. Poirot settled onto a chair, his posture impeccable, his eyes studying her with a blend of compassion and scrutiny. "Your devotion to Monsieur Duval is admirable, mademoiselle. You attended his recital on the night of his death, and you lingered, hoping to speak with him. Tell me again, what happened when you approached his studio door?" Clara's hands trembled, and she sank back onto the sofa. "It was after the recital, about 11:30. I couldn't bear to leave without trying to see him. I went to his studio door and knocked, but it was locked. I heard him playing, a melody so beautiful, so full of longing, it broke my heart. I waited, hoping he'd open the door, but there was only silence after a while. I thought he was working, so I left." Poirot's fingers steepled before him, his gaze unwavering. "This melody, mademoiselle, you described it as a lament, unresolved, played on the violin. It is a vivid memory for one who stood outside a locked door. Can you recall any specific notes, Any phrase that lingered? Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to the violin on the table. It was high and mournful, with a slow descent like a sigh. I can't read music well, but I know how it felt, like it was calling to me, begging to be heard. Her voice wavered, and she looked away, her fingers twisting the handkerchief. Hastings, standing near the door, frowned. "That's awfully detailed, Miss Merton. Are you sure you didn't see anything? Perhaps a glimpse of the score through a crack in the door." Clara's head snapped up, her cheeks flushing. "No, the door was solid and I didn't see anything. I only heard him. I swear it." Poirot's eyes narrowed, catching a faint smudge of ink on the cuff of her sleeve, barely visible in the lamplight. It was the same dark shade as the smudge on the letter in Duval's studio, a detail that sent a spark through his mind. "Mademoiselle," he said, his tone soft but probing, "you are passionate about Monsieur Duval's music. Did you ever visit his studio before that night, perhaps to see his work, to touch the scores that meant so much to you?" Clara's hands stilled, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "Once or twice, he let me in. He was kind, showed me his violin, played a few bars for me. But I never saw the Symphonie Fantôme. He kept it hidden, said it wasn't ready for anyone." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "And yet, mademoiselle, you describe its melody with such precision. And this—" He gestured delicately toward her sleeve. "This ink, it is most curious. It matches a mark found on a paper in Duval's studio, a mark not made by his careful hand. Can you explain this?" Clara's eyes widened, and she tugged her sleeve down, covering the smudge. I don't know. I write letters, practice calligraphy sometimes. It's just ink from my pen." Her voice trembled, and she looked away, her fingers resuming their nervous dance with the handkerchief. Poirot's smile was gentle, but his gaze was unrelenting. "Calligraphy, oui, a fine art. But the ink in Duval's studio suggests a presence, a touch, at the time of his death. You were near his door, mademoiselle, and your devotion, it is a powerful force. Powerful enough, perhaps, to drive you to act?" Clara's face crumpled, and she shook her head vehemently. "No, I loved him. His music, I mean. I'd never hurt him. I only wanted to hear the Symphonie Fantôme, to feel it the way he did. When I heard that melody, I thought it was a gift, a moment meant for me. But I didn't go inside. I didn't take anything." Hastings stepped closer, his voice kind but firm. "But you lingered, Miss Merton. The bookshop owner said you were the last to leave, hovering by the stairs. If you heard something, saw something, now's the time to tell us." Clara's tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't see anything. I swear, I only heard the music." Then silence. "I went home after that. Ask my landlady. She saw me come in before midnight." Poirot rose, adjusting his coat with a precise tug. "We shall, mademoiselle. Your landlady, the stagehand, the bookshop owner, their words will help us tune this melody of truth. For now, I thank you for your candor. Remain in London, s'il vous plaît. We may have need of you again." As they stepped back into the street, the gaslights now fully aglow, Hastings turned to Poirot, his brow furrowed. "She's a bundle of nerves, Poirot. That ink on her sleeve, it's too close to the studio's smudge to be coincidence. And her story about the melody, it's almost as if she's reciting a script." Poirot nodded, his cane tapping softly on the pavement. "Oui, Hastings. Her devotion is a symphony of its own. But is it pure, or does it hide a darker note? The ink, the melody, her presence by the stairs. These are clues, but they do not yet sing in harmony. We must confirm her return home with the landlady, and we must revisit the studio. The silence she heard after the music, it is as telling as the notes themselves. They hailed a cab, the driver's horse snorting in the cold air. As they rattled toward Bloomsbury, Poirot's mind churned, weaving Clara's trembling voice, Voss's steely defiance, and Langston's nervous ambition into the tapestry of the case. The Symphonie Fantôme was a ghost, its notes echoing only in memory, but Poirot was determined to follow its trail, to uncover the devotion or deception that had silenced its creator forever. Chapter 7. The Locked Room. Unraveled. The fog had thickened over Bloomsbury by late afternoon, wrapping the streets in a ghostly shroud that seemed to mirror the mystery of Maurice Duval's death. Hercule Poirot, his overcoat buttoned against the damp, stood within the confines of the violinist's studio, his sharp eyes scanning the room as if it might whisper its secrets. Captain Arthur Hastings stood by the door, his hands clasped behind him, his honest face etched with the strain of their relentless pursuit. Inspector Japp, summoned from Scotland Yard, leaned against the grand piano, his notebook open but his patience visibly fraying. The locked studio, with its heavy oak door, barred window, and lingering scent of cyanide, remained a fortress of enigma, daring Poirot to breach its defenses. "Monsieur Poirot," Japp said, his voice tinged with exasperation, "we've turned this place upside down. The door was locked, the key in Duval's pocket, the window barred. The cyanide was in the brandy glass, not the bottle. And that blasted Symphonie Fantôme is nowhere to be found. If you've got a theory, now's the time to share it." Poirot's mustache twitched, and he paced the room with measured steps, his cane tapping a soft rhythm on the polished floorboards. "Patience, mon ami," he replied, his tone calm but vibrant with purpose. "The locked room, it is not a wall, but a puzzle, and the pieces are here, waiting for the little gray cells to assemble them. Let us begin with what we know." He stopped at the desk, where the empty folder labeled Symphonie Fantôme lay like a silent accusation. The smudged letter, with its ink-stained edge, remained where they had left it, a discordant note in Duval's orderly world. Poirot's gloved fingers hovered over it, his eyes narrowing. "The poison," he said, "was in the glass, administered before Duval locked himself in. This suggests a murderer with access to the studio earlier in the evening, one who knew Duval's habit of a nightly brandy." Hastings nodded, his brow furrowed. "But who, Poirot? Langston was at the tavern, or so he claims. Voss was seen near the stairs, but she denies going up. And Clara, well, she was lurking about, but she swears she only heard music through the door." Poirot's gaze shifted to the high, barred window, its iron lattice unyielding in the dim light. "The window, Hastings. It is the key to the theft, if not the murder. Regarde, the scratch on the sill, so faint yet so deliberate." He climbed the small stool he had used before, his movements precise despite his compact frame. His fingers traced the mark again, a shallow groove running parallel to the bars. "This is not the work of whether or where. It speaks of something passed through, a paper, perhaps, drawn by a clever hand." Japp snorted, crossing his arms. "A paper through a window? You're saying someone fished the score out from 3 stories below? That's a tall order, Poirot, even for a clever murderer." Poirot descended, his eyes gleaming with quiet excitement. "Not impossible, Inspector. A fishing line, a hook, a moment of opportunity. The symphony fantôme was on the desk, within reach of the window. The bars are close, but there is a gap, small, but sufficient for a folded sheet to pass through. To test his theory, Poirot summoned a locksmith, a wiry man named Mr. Grayson, who arrived with a bag of tools and a skeptical frown. Grayson examined the window, measuring the gap between the bars with a caliper. "It's tight," he said, his voice gruff. "Less than an inch. You'd need a steady hand and a thin line to pull anything through. But it's possible. I'll grant you that." Poirot's smile was triumphant. "Merci, Monsieur Grayson. This gap, it is the door through which our phantom score escaped. But the poison, this is another matter. It was placed in the glass before Duval locked the door, by one who could enter freely earlier in the evening." Japp flipped through his notebook. "We've checked the alibis. Langston's story at the Black Swan holds. Patrons saw him there from 11 onward, but there's a gap between 10 and 11. Voss was with Pennington until about 10:30, then claims she went home. The stagehand swears she was by the stairs closer to midnight, though. Clara Merton's landlady confirms she was home by midnight, but she could have slipped out earlier." Poirot paced again, his mind weaving the threads together. "Let us reconstruct, mes amis. The recital ends at 10. Duval ascends to his studio, locks the door. Clara hears music at 11:30, then silence. By 1, he is dead. The score gone. The poison was in the glass, waiting for him. The score was taken later, through the window, by one who knew its precise location on the desk." Hastings rubbed his chin. "But how did they know where to fish for it? You'd need to see inside to aim just right." Poirot's eyes sparkled. "Exactement, Hastings. The murderer or an accomplice was familiar with the studio's layout. They knew Duval's desk, his habits, and this—" He pointed to the smudged letter. "This ink, it links to Mademoiselle Merton's sleeve, yet it could belong to another. Langston, with his copied notation. Voss, with her access to scores. One of them was here, or near enough to act." Japp scratched his head. "So you're saying the murder and the theft are separate acts? Poison first, then the score snatched through the window?" "Perhaps," Poirot said, his voice low. "Or perhaps one act, one mind, orchestrating both. We must search for evidence of this fishing line, this hook, a trace of thread, a snag on the sill. Something remains, I am certain." They combed the studio again, Japp's constables scouring the floor and window frame. Near the base of the sill, hidden in a crack, a constable found a tiny fragment of fine twine, barely visible to the naked eye. Poirot examined it under a magnifying glass, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "This twine, it is our phantom string, strong enough to pull a folded score, light enough to be unseen in the dark." Japp's skepticism wavered. "All right, Poirot, I'll give you the theft. But the poison, who got to the glass? Duval didn't let just anyone in here." Poirot's gaze returned to the desk, to the violin case, its strings dusted with rosin. "Duval played that night, as Clara heard. He was alive, working, until the brandy took him. The murderer visited earlier, perhaps under a pretext. Langston to mend their rivalry, Voss to discuss the score, Clara to express her devotion. One of them left death in that glass." Hastings, ever practical, frowned. "But Poirot, if the poison was quick-acting, how did they time it? Duval could have drunk the brandy right after they left or hours later." Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "A question of habit, mon ami. Duval's nightly brandy was known to those close to him. The murderer relied on this ritual, placing the cyanide when they knew he would drink alone after the recital. The theft, however, required precision, a return to the scene under cover of night. Jap closed his notebook with a snap. So we're looking for someone who was here twice, once to poison, once to steal. Langston's got the motive, Voss the opportunity, Clara the obsession. But we need more, Poirot. Something solid. Poirot nodded, his eyes drifting to the empty folder. Solid, but the truth is often a melody, not a stone. We must question the stagehand again, confirm Voss's presence by the stairs. We must search Langston's flat for traces of this twine, or the score itself. And Clara, her landlady's word is not enough. We must know her movements precisely. As they left the studio, the fog seemed to close in, a fitting veil for the mystery's unresolved notes. Poirot's mind hummed with the rhythm of the case, the scratch on the sill, the smudge of ink, the fragment of twine, all chords in a symphony of deceit. The symphony fantôme was out there, its notes stolen but not silenced, and Poirot was determined to play them back to the truth. Chapter 8. The Phantom Revealed. The evening sky over Bloomsbury was a tapestry of deep indigo, pierced by the soft glow of gaslights, as Hercule Poirot gathered the threads of the mystery in Maurice Duval's studio. The room, still heavy with the echo of tragedy, had been transformed into a stage for revelation. The grand piano stood silent, the violin rested in its velvet case, and the empty folder labeled Symphonie Fantôme lay on the desk like a mute witness. Poirot stood at the room's center, his compact figure radiating authority, his mustache perfectly symmetrical above a serene yet piercing expression. Captain Arthur Hastings sat on a chair near the door, his honest face alight with anticipation, while Inspector Japp stood by the window, his arms crossed, his skepticism tempered by trust in Poirot's methods. The three suspects, Victor Langston, Eleanor Voss, and Clara Merton, sat in a tense semicircle, their faces a study in contrasting emotions. Langston's nervous defiance, Voss's icy composure, and Clara's tearful unease. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice smooth and deliberate, "we are here to resolve the tragedy of Maurice Duval, a man whose genius was silenced by poison and whose masterpiece, the Symphonie Fantôme, was stolen from this very room. A locked door, a barred window, a glass of cyanide-laced brandy. These are the notes of our mystery. But tonight, with the aid of the little gray cells, we shall play the final chord." Langston shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming on his knee. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "I've told you, I was at the Black Swan." Voss's eyes narrowed, her posture rigid. "Get on with it, Monsieur Poirot. I have rehearsals to attend." Clara clutched her handkerchief, her voice barely audible. "I just want this to be over." Poirot raised a hand, silencing them with a gesture. "Patience, s'il vous plaît. Let us begin with the crime. Monsieur Duval died of cyanide, placed in his brandy glass before he locked himself in this studio. The poison was swift, but the theft of the Symphonie Fantôme required cunning. A score pulled through the window's bars by a fishing line, as evidenced by the scratch on the sill and the fragment of twine we found. He paced slowly, his cane tapping softly. The locked room, it seems impossible, yet it is not. The poison was placed earlier by one who knew Duval's habit of a nightly brandy. The theft came later, after his death, when the studio was silent. But who could orchestrate such a crime? Let us examine our players. He turned to Langston, his eyes sharp as a conductor's baton. "Monsieur Langston, your ambition burned brightly. Duval's success cast a shadow over your own, and you admitted to envying his genius. We found a scrap of music in your flat, a melody echoing Duval's style. Too close to be mere coincidence. You claimed it was an exercise, but it was a copy, was it not? A piece of the symphony fantôme, traced in haste." Langston's face flushed, and he stood, his voice rising. "That's nonsense. I told you, I was at the tavern. I never saw his score." Poirot's smile was unyielding. "The tavern, oui, but not until 11, leaving an hour unaccounted for after the recital. Time enough to visit Duval, perhaps under the guise of reconciliation, to slip cyanide into his glass. And later, knowing the score's value, you returned, using a fishing line through the window to steal it, hoping to claim it as your own." Langston's hands balled into fists, but Poirot turned to Voss before he could protest further. "Madame Voss, your ambition was no less fierce. The symphony fantôme was to be your triumph, the Philharmonic's crowning glory. Duval's refusal to share it angered you, and you were seen near the studio stairs near midnight, despite claiming to have left earlier. Did you, perhaps, visit Duval to plead for the score, only to leave death in your wake?" Voss's lips curled in disdain. "Absurd. I needed Maurice alive to premiere his work. I was with Pennington planning a concert and went home by 11. The stagehand is mistaken." Poirot's gaze shifted to Clara, whose tears had ceased, her eyes wide with fear. "And you, Mademoiselle Merton, your devotion to Duval was a melody of its own. You lingered by the stairs, heard a haunting lament through the door. You described it with such precision, a melody you could not have known unless you saw the score, and the ink on your sleeve matching the smudge on Duval's desk. Did you enter, perhaps, driven by love to take what he would not share?" Clara shook her head, her voice breaking. "No, I loved his music, not him. I never went inside. I only heard the violin, then silence." Poirot paused, his eyes sweeping the room. 3 motives: ambition, glory, devotion, 3 opportunities: the hour before the tavern, the lingering by the stairs, the knock at the door. But only one truth. He reached into his pocket, producing the scrap of music from Langston's flat and a tiny metal hook, its tip engraved with the initials VL. "This hook," he said, holding it aloft, "was found in the studio's dust, near the window. It bears your initials, Monsieur Langston. You visited Duval before the recital, did you not? You spoke of old times, shared a drink, but you poisoned his glass, knowing he would drink later, alone. After the recital, you returned, using this hook and a line to pull the symphony fantôme from the desk through the window's bars." Langston's face drained of color, and he staggered back, his voice hoarse. "No, you can't prove that." Poirot's voice was relentless. "The scrap in your flat, the ink smudge matching Duval's desk, the twine, the hook. These are your notes, monsieur. You copied the score in haste, intending to pass it as your own, to reclaim the fame Duval stole from you." Langston collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands. "All right, I did it. I hated him, his genius, his ease. I went to his studio that afternoon, pretending to bury the hatchet. I slipped the cyanide into his glass when he turned to fetch his violin. Later, I came back, used the line to take the score. I thought I could be him, just for one piece." Japp stepped forward, his handcuffs glinting in the gaslight. "Victor Langston, you're under arrest for the murder of Maurice Duval." As the constables led Langston away, his shoulders slumped in defeat, Clara let out a sob, her relief palpable. Voss rose, her expression unreadable, but her eyes softened by a flicker of sorrow. "He was a fool," she said quietly. "Maurice's music was never meant for theft." Poirot adjusted his hat, his work complete. "The Symphonie Fantôme will be recovered, madame, and its notes will sing again. But for now, the silence of justice is enough." As they stepped into the foggy night, the mystery resolved. Poirot's mind was already turning to the next puzzle, the next phantom waiting to be revealed. Chapter 9. The Final Note. The fog had lifted from Bloomsbury's streets, revealing a crisp November night, where stars glimmered faintly above the gaslit glow of London. Hercule Poirot stood by the barred window of Maurice Duval's studio, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the skyline, as if it might echo the resolution of the case. The room, now emptied of suspects and constables, held a quiet reverence, its grand piano and violin case silent witnesses to the tragedy and its unraveling. Captain Arthur Hastings, ever the faithful companion, lingered near the desk, his broad frame restless with the afterglow of Poirot's triumph. Inspector Japp, his notebook tucked away, had departed to oversee Victor Langston's processing at Scotland Yard, leaving Poirot and Hastings to reflect on the symphony of clues that had led to the truth. "Hastings, mon ami," Poirot said, his voice soft yet resonant. "The case of the Symphonie Fantôme is closed, yet its melody lingers. The little gray cells, they have played their part, but it is the heart of Maurice Duval, his genius, his ambition, that composed this tragedy." Hastings turned, his honest face creased with curiosity. "I say, Poirot, you had Langston pegged from the start, didn't you? That scrap of music, the hook with his initials. It was like you saw the whole score before anyone else." Poirot's mustache twitched, a faint smile curling beneath it. "Non, Hastings, not from the start. The clues, they were like notes scattered across a page, disordered, yet waiting for harmony. The smudge of ink, the scratch on the sill, the twine, the hook, these were the chords. But it was Langston's ambition, his envy, that gave them rhythm. He could not bear to live in Duval's shadow, so he sought to steal his light." Hastings nodded, picking up the empty folder labeled Symphonie Fantôme from the desk. "And the score itself, do you think Japp's men will find it in Langston's flat? It's a shame to think it might never be played." Poirot turned from the window, his eyes gleaming with quiet certainty. "Fear not, mon ami. Langston's confession will lead us to it. He copied only fragments, enough to claim as his own, but the original, I am certain, remains hidden among his papers. The Symphonie Fantôme will sing. Again, for Duval's legacy is not so easily silenced." The door creaked open, and Clara Merton stepped hesitantly into the room, her auburn hair catching the lamplight. Her eyes, no longer brimming with tears, held a fragile hope. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice steady despite her pallor, "I heard they've taken Mr. Langston. Is it true? Was it really him?" Poirot inclined his head, his manner gentle. "Oui, mademoiselle. Monsieur Langston has confessed. He poisoned Monsieur Duval and stole the Symphonie Fantôme, driven by a jealousy that consumed him. Your idol's memory is cleared, and his music will be restored." Clara's hands clasped together, and she exhaled a trembling breath. "Thank you. I couldn't bear to think someone so cruel took him from us. His music, it was everything to me." Poirot's gaze softened, but his voice held a note of caution. "Your devotion, mademoiselle, is a beautiful thing, but it must not blind you. You lingered by the stairs. You heard the melody. Your heart was too close to this tragedy. Be careful in future that love does not lead you to dark places." Clara nodded, her cheeks flushing, and slipped out as quietly as she had come. Hastings watched her go, then turned to Poirot. "She's lucky, isn't she? If that ink smudge had been hers, or if she'd pushed harder to see Duval, she might have been tangled up in this mess." "Oui," Poirot agreed, adjusting his hat with a precise tug. Mademoiselle Merton's devotion was a melody of its own, but it was Langston's discord that played the fatal note. And Madame Voss, she too will learn from this. Her ambition for the Symphonie Fantôme was honorable, but it blinded her to the cost of pride. Hastings frowned, glancing at the violin case. "Voss seemed shaken, didn't she? When Langston confessed, I thought I saw something like regret in her eyes." Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "She is a woman of control, Hastings, but even she feels the weight of loss. She will honor Duval's legacy, I think, by ensuring his music is heard. The Philharmonic will play the Symphonie Fantôme, and its notes will carry his name beyond this tragedy." They stepped out into the night, the studio door closing behind them with a soft thud. The bookshop below was dark, its windows shuttered, but the memory of Duval's recital lingered, a haunting echo of genius cut short. Poirot paused on the pavement, his cane gleaming under the gaslight, and looked up at the studio window, its bars a silent sentinel. "Hastings," he said, his voice low. "This case, it reminds us that genius is a flame that draws both light and shadow. Langston sought to steal that flame, but he could not extinguish it. The Symphonie Fantôme will live, because truth, like music, endures." Hastings smiled, warmed by his friend's certainty. "You're right, Poirot, and you've done it again, plucked the truth from a tangle of lies. I don't know how you do it, but I'm dashed glad you're on our side." Poirot's eyes twinkled as he adjusted his coat. "The little gray cells, mon ami, they listen where others only hear. Now, let us find a cab. A cup of tisane awaits, and perhaps a moment to savor the silence of a case well solved." As they walked into the night, the city's hum enveloped them, a symphony of life that carried no trace of the phantom note. Maurice Duval's music would rise again, and Hercule Poirot, with his inimitable flair, had ensured its melody would not be forgotten.